The sun hung mercilessly over the dusty Wyoming trail as Garnet Newman struggled to take another step. The year was 1878, and at 7 months pregnant and alone, she was beginning to realize her desperate journey west might have been a terrible mistake. Her trembling fingers clutched the worn letter in her pocket, the last correspondence from her husband, before word came of his death in a mining accident. Now she was headed toward the only family she had left, an aunt in Montana Territory who might take her in. Garnet's vision blurred as the blistering heat beat down on her bonnet. The water in her canteen had run dry hours ago. Her swollen ankles throbbed with each step, and the baby inside her kicked restlessly, as if sensing her distress. She had been foolish to attempt this final stretch of the journey alone after the wagon train she joined had taken a different route 3 days back. But she'd been determined, stubborn, unwilling to add weeks to her journey. Just a little farther, she whispered to herself, to her unborn child. But her legs betrayed her, buckling beneath her weight as she collapsed onto the hard, packed earth of the trail. As consciousness slipped away, Garnet thought she heard the distant thunder of hoofbeats. Her last sensation was of dust swirling around her fallen form as darkness claimed her. Flynn Ryder had been tracking the herd of wild mustangs for nearly a week. As a horse trader who specialized in breaking and selling the finest mounts in the territory, he had his eye on the magnificent black stallion that led the group. He'd nearly had the herd cornered in a narrow canyon when a dust devil spooked them, sending the horses scattering in all directions. Cursing his luck, Flynn reined in his own mount, a sturdy Palomino named Chance, and turned back toward the trail. He'd have to try again tomorrow. As he crested the ridge that overlooked the main trail, something caught his eye, a splash of faded blue fabric against the dusty brown earth. "What in tarnation?" he muttered, urging Chance forward. As he drew closer, the shape resolved itself into a woman's form, face down in the dirt. Flynn dismounted in a fluid motion, rushing to the fallen figure. Gently, he turned her over, noting with alarm both her pregnancy and the heat radiating from her skin. She was alive but barely conscious, her lips cracked from dehydration, her face flushed with fever. "Madam, can you hear me?" He called, uncorking his canteen and lifting it to her parched lips. Garnet's eyes fluttered open, revealing irises the color of summer sage. She managed a small sip of water before coughing weakly. "My baby," she whispered, her hand protectively covering her swollen belly. "You're both going to be fine," Flynn assured her, though he wasn't at all certain. They were at least 15 miles from his cabin, and the woman was clearly in no condition to ride. "What's your name, madam?" "Garnet," she managed, her voice barely audible. "Garnet Newman." "Miss Newman, I'm Flynn Ryder. I've got a place not far from here. I'm going to take you there and get you fixed up. You understand?" She gave an almost imperceptible nod before her eyes slid closed again. Flynn assessed the situation quickly. He couldn't put her on his horse in her condition. The ride would be too jarring for her and the baby. There was only one option. He'd have to carry her. After fashioning a makeshift sling to secure her to his chest using his bedroll and some rope, Flynn lifted Garnet's limp form. She weighed surprisingly little for a woman in her condition. With one arm supporting her back and the other beneath her knees, he mounted Chance, who snorted at the unusual arrangement. "Easy, boy," Flynn murmured. "We've got precious cargo." The journey back would take hours on foot, leading his horse along the safest path. Flynn set off at a steady pace, mindful of each step on the uneven terrain. The Wyoming summer sun beat down relentlessly, but he didn't dare stop for more than brief rests to give Garnet sips of water and check her condition. As the afternoon wore on, Flynn's arms began to burn with the strain of carrying her. Sweat soaked through his shirt, and his legs threatened to cramp with each step. Yet something drove him forward, perhaps the occasional flutter he felt against his chest, the baby making its presence known, or the fleeting moments when Garnet's eyes would open, confused but grateful. "My husband," she murmured during one such moment of consciousness. "He's gone, mining accident." Flynn tightened his grip slightly. "I'm sorry to hear that, madam. Where were you headed?" "Montana, my aunt." Her words were slurred with exhaustion. "Only family left." Flynn nodded, though she had already slipped back into unconsciousness. So she was a widow, traveling alone and pregnant. The thought of her vulnerability made his jaw clench. What kind of world allowed a woman in her condition to face such peril alone? The sun was beginning to dip toward the horizon when Flynn finally spotted the familiar outline of his cabin nestled in a grove of pines. It wasn't much 2 rooms with a lean-to addition he'd built for his supplies, but it was solid, and right now it represented safety. "Almost there," he told Garnet, though she gave no sign of hearing. By the time he reached the cabin door, Flynn's entire body trembled with exertion. His arms felt like lead weights, and his back screamed in protest as he shouldered open the door and carried Garnet to his bed. Gently, he laid her down, then immediately set about making her comfortable. He removed her dusty boots and loosened her collar, then soaked a clean cloth in water from the bucket by the hearth and placed it on her forehead. Flynn had limited experience with pregnant women, but he knew enough to recognize that Garnet and her baby needed more help than he alone could provide. The nearest doctor was in Buffalo, nearly 30 miles away, and Mrs. Hatcher, the midwife who served the scattered homesteads in the area, lived a good 10 miles to the east. After ensuring Garnet was as comfortable as possible, Flynn stepped outside to care for Chance and consider his options. Night was falling fast, and he couldn't leave Garnet alone in her condition. He'd have to wait until morning to ride for help. Inside the cabin, he built up the fire and prepared a simple broth, hoping its aroma might rouse his unexpected guest. To his relief, when he approached the bed with a cup of the steaming liquid, Garnet's eyes were open, clearer than before. "Where am I?" she asked, her voice stronger though still raspy. "My cabin. Name's Flynn Ryder, case you don't recall our earlier introduction." "You collapsed on the trail about 15 miles back." Garnet's eyes widened as memory returned. "You carried me all that way," Flynn shrugged, suddenly self-conscious. "Couldn't very well leave you there." The baby, her hands flew to her stomach. "Seems fine, far as I can tell." "Been kicking up a storm the last hour or so." Flynn offered her the broth. "Think you can manage some of this? You need your strength." Garnet nodded, attempting to sit up. Flynn quickly moved to support her, placing an extra pillow behind her back before handing her the cup. Their fingers brushed briefly, and he noticed a faint flush creep into her cheeks that had nothing to do with her earlier fever. "Thank you, Mr. Ryder. I don't know how I can ever repay your kindness." "Flynn, please, and there's no need for repayment. Anyone would have done the same." "No," Garnet said with surprising firmness. "Not anyone would have carried a stranger for 15 miles. I owe you my life and my child's." Flynn felt heat rise to his own cheeks. He wasn't accustomed to gratitude or to having a beautiful woman, for she was beautiful, despite her condition and ordeal, looking at him with such earnest appreciation. "Rest now," he said gruffly, standing. "Tomorrow I'll ride for the midwife, Mrs. Hatcher's got a fair hand with birthing and women's ailments. She'll know what to do for you." "I'm not due for another 2 months, Garnet protested. "All the same, best to have her check you over. That was quite a spell you had on the trail." Flynn moved to the hearth, busying himself with tending the fire. "You said you were headed to Montana, to your aunt's?" "Yes, she's all the family I have left since Thomas," Garnet's voice caught. "Since my husband died. I couldn't stay in Pennsylvania, too many memories and his family." She shook her head. "They made it clear I wasn't welcome without him." Flynn's jaw tightened at the implied cruelty. "Well, you're welcome here until you're fit to travel, though I'd advise waiting until after the little one arrives. Montana'll still be there." Garnet's eyes filled with tears. "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't come along. I thought," she broke off, her hand protectively cradling her belly. "I thought we were going to die out there." Flynn crossed back to the bed and, after a moment's hesitation, took her free hand in his. "But you didn't. You're both going to be fine, I promise." The conviction in his voice surprised even him. Flynn wasn't a man given to making promises he couldn't keep. Yet looking into Garnet's vulnerable green eyes, he knew he'd move heaven and earth to ensure this one was kept. Morning came with a clarity that only the high country could deliver. Flynn had spent an uncomfortable night on a pallet by the fire, rising frequently to check on Garnet. Her fever had broken sometime in the early hours, and she now slept peacefully, her breathing deep and regular. Flynn moved quietly through his morning routine, preparing coffee and a simple breakfast of bacon and biscuits. The familiar tasks helped settle his unexpected nervousness. It had been years since he'd shared his space with anyone, let alone a woman. Garnet stirred as the aroma of coffee filled the cabin. She opened her eyes to find Flynn watching her from beside the hearth. "Morning," he said, pouring a cup of coffee. "How are you feeling?" Garnet took stock of her condition. "Better, much better, actually." She pushed herself up to sitting, noticing she was wearing the same dusty traveling dress from yesterday. "Though I must look a fright." "You look fine," Flynn said, then quickly amended, "I mean, considering what you've been through." He brought her the coffee, then gestured to a small trunk in the corner. "I've got some clean shirts in there if you want to change. They'll be big on you, but fresher than what you're wearing." "That's very kind. I would appreciate that." After breakfast, which Garnet managed to eat with surprising appetite, Flynn prepared to ride for the midwife. "I should be back by midday with Mrs. Hatcher," he explained, checking the provisions in his saddlebag. "There's water in the bucket and more food on the shelf if you get hungry." "You should rest, though. Don't try to do too much." Garnet smiled at his concern. "I'll be fine, Flynn, truly." He nodded, suddenly reluctant to leave her. "Lock the door behind me, not that there's much trouble out this way, but just to be safe." After Flynn departed, Garnet took the opportunity to wash herself with water from the bucket and change into one of his offered shirts. The soft flannel hung nearly to her knees, but it felt wonderful to be out of her travel-stained clothing. She found a comb in her small bag of possessions and worked the tangles from her honey-brown hair, braiding it neatly down her back. Looking around the cabin, Garnet was struck by its austere simplicity. Flynn clearly lived alone and had for some time. There were no personal touches, no photographs or mementos, nothing to indicate a past or connections beyond these walls. Yet the space was clean and well-maintained, with a small bookshelf holding a dozen well-worn volumes, evidence of an educated mind that surprised her. Despite Flynn's admonition to rest, Garnet couldn't bring herself to return to bed. Her body ached from yesterday's collapse, but the overwhelming exhaustion had lifted. She moved carefully around the cabin, taking stock of her surroundings and, almost unconsciously, beginning to tidy the already neat space. She had just put a pot of beans on to simmer when the baby delivered a particularly strong kick. Garnet placed her hand over the spot, smiling. "You're feeling better too, aren't you, little one? We were lucky yesterday, so very lucky." The image of Flynn carrying her for miles along the dusty trail filled her mind. What kind of man would do such a thing for a stranger? In her experience, men were not to be relied upon. Her husband's family had made that abundantly clear after Thomas's death. Yet Flynn had risked his own health and safety for her without hesitation. Garnet was pondering this when she heard hoofbeats approaching. Looking out the window, she saw Flynn returning with an older woman riding alongside him. Mrs. Hatcher, she presumed. The midwife turned out to be a no-nonsense woman in her 60s with silver hair pulled into a tight bun and eyes that missed nothing. She examined Garnet thoroughly, checking her pulse, feeling her abdomen, and asking pointed questions about her condition before, during, and after her collapse. "The baby's positioned well," Mrs. Hatcher announced finally. "Strong heartbeat. You're lucky, Mrs. Newman. Heat exhaustion can bring on early labor, but you seem to have escaped that particular danger. Still, you need rest and plenty of fluids. No more traveling until that baby's born and strong enough for the journey." "But my aunt is expecting me," Garnet protested weakly. "Mrs. Hatcher fixed her with a stern look. "Your aunt would rather have you arrive late than not at all, or worse, lose that baby because you were too stubborn to heed good advice." Flynn, who had been hovering anxiously nearby, stepped forward. "She can stay here." "I've got the space and I'm not using the bed anyway." Mrs. Hatcher raised an eyebrow. "That's mighty generous, Mr. Ryder, but perhaps not entirely proper." "There's the Henderson place," Flynn suggested. "Empty since they moved back east last fall. It's just a mile down the creek." "That drafty old shack," Mrs. Hatcher scoffed. "No place for a woman in her condition." She studied Flynn for a long moment, then turned to Garnet. "Mr. Ryder's right about one thing: you need somewhere safe to stay until that baby comes. I'd offer my own home, but I've got my daughter and her 3 little ones visiting from Cheyenne." She seemed to come to a decision. "Here's what we'll do. You'll stay with Mr. Ryder, but I'll come by regular to check on you both and to ensure everything remains proper. I'll also spread the word that I've taken on a temporary assistant so there's no cause for gossip." Flynn looked relieved, while Garnet felt a flush creep up her cheeks at the implication. "I don't want to impose," she began. "Nonsense," Mrs. Hatcher cut her off. "From what I hear, this man carried you 15 miles yesterday. If he was willing to do that, I expect he can tolerate your company for a few more weeks." She packed her bag with brisk efficiency. "I'll be back in 3 days unless you need me sooner. Meanwhile, plenty of rest, lots of water, and good, nourishing food." After Mrs. Hatcher departed, an awkward silence fell between Garnet and Flynn. They were strangers bound together by circumstance, now facing weeks in close quarters. "I meant what I said," Flynn finally spoke. "You're welcome here as long as you need." "Thank you," Garnet said softly, "though I feel terrible about putting you out of your own bed." "I've slept in worse places than my own floor," Flynn assured her. Then, with an attempt at levity, "At least I won't have to carry you around anymore." Garnet smiled, grateful for his effort to ease the tension. "Unless this little one decides to make an early appearance." "Let's hope not," Flynn replied, his expression suddenly serious. "I know horses, not babies." The next few days settled into an unexpected rhythm. Flynn rose early to tend to his horses and the small garden behind the cabin, while Garnet took over the domestic duties to the extent her condition allowed. They were both private people, accustomed to solitude, yet somehow their forced proximity bred not friction but a comfortable sort of companionship. In the evenings, Flynn would read aloud from one of his books. Dickens was a favorite, while Garnet mended clothing or worked on the baby blanket she'd started knitting months ago. Sometimes they simply talked, sharing pieces of their pasts in the soft glow of the lamp. Flynn learned that Garnet had grown up in Philadelphia, the daughter of a schoolteacher. She'd met Thomas Newman when she was 19, married him at 20, and spent 3 years trying to conceive before finally succeeding. Thomas had gone west to make his fortune in the gold fields just after learning of the pregnancy, promising to send for Garnet once he was established. Instead, she'd received word of his death in a mine collapse. In turn, Garnet discovered that Flynn had left his home in Boston at 17 after a bitter falling out with his wealthy father. He'd worked his way west, taking jobs as a ranch hand, a stagecoach driver, and eventually a scout for the army before settling on horse trading. He'd been on his own for so long that he sometimes went weeks without speaking to another soul, but he didn't seem to mind the solitude. "Don't you ever get lonely?" Garnet asked one evening as they sat on the small porch, watching the sunset paint the Wyoming sky in shades of gold and crimson. Flynn considered the question seriously. "I suppose I did at first, but you get used to the quiet, start to prefer it even." He glanced at her, his expression softening. "Though I admit these past days have been pleasant." Garnet felt warmth bloom in her chest at his words. "They have," she agreed quietly. As July turned to August, Garnet's condition became more pronounced. The baby was active, especially in the evenings, sometimes causing her visible discomfort. One night, Flynn found her pacing the cabin floor, one hand pressed to her lower back. "Everything all right?" he asked, concern evident in his voice. "Just restless," Garnet assured him. "This little one seems to think my ribs make an excellent footrest." Flynn hesitated, then said, "My mother used to say that a walking baby is a healthy baby, means they've got spirit." Garnet paused her pacing, surprised. Flynn rarely mentioned his family. "Your mother sounds wise." "She was," he said softly. "She died when I was 14, consumption." "I'm sorry," Garnet said, moving to stand beside him. On impulse, she took his hand and placed it against her belly where the baby was particularly active. "Feel that, that's spirit." Flynn's eyes widened at the sensation of the baby moving beneath his palm. For a moment, neither of them breathed. Then the baby kicked sharply, and Flynn let out a surprised laugh. "That's some spirit," he said, his voice unusually gentle. His hand lingered, warm against her, and Garnet found herself leaning slightly into his touch. The moment was broken by a particularly strong kick that made Garnet wince. Flynn withdrew his hand, suddenly self-conscious. "You should try to rest," he said, stepping back. "Big day tomorrow with Mrs. Hatcher's visit." Garnet nodded, though she felt a curious sense of loss as he moved away. "Good night, Flynn." "Good night, Garnet, Mrs." Hatcher's visits had become weekly affairs, bringing not only medical attention but also news from the surrounding area and, increasingly, supplies for the coming baby. The midwife seemed to have appointed herself Garnet's unofficial guardian, always arriving with some new necessity-clean cloths for diapers, a small wooden cradle obtained from a family whose youngest had outgrown it, soft flannel for baby gowns. "The Henderson girl had twins last spring," she explained, unpacking her latest offerings. "These are the extras she doesn't need anymore." Garnet accepted the gifts gratefully, though privately she worried about her ability to transport them all when she eventually continued to Montana. The thought of leaving, however, had begun to fill her with an unexpected reluctance that she tried not to examine too closely. As August progressed, the weather turned sultry, the air thick with humidity that promised afternoon thunderstorms. On one such day, Flynn returned from checking his fences to find Garnet in obvious distress, her face flushed and her breathing labored. "What's wrong?" he demanded, rushing to her side. "I don't know," she gasped. "Sharp pain, then nothing, then again." She clutched her abdomen. "It's too early." "The baby's not due for another 3 weeks." Flynn felt a surge of panic. "I'll get Mrs. Hatcher." "No time," Garnet panted as another pain seized her. I think the baby's coming now." Flynn had never felt more helpless. He knew how to deliver foals, but a human baby was altogether different. Still, he couldn't leave Garnet alone in her condition, and the storm brewing outside would make the 10-mile journey to the midwife's home treacherous. "All right," he said, forcing a calmness he didn't feel. "Tell me what you need." "Clean water," Garnet managed between contractions. "Lots of it, and the cloths Mrs. Hatcher brought. They're in the trunk." Flynn moved quickly, building up the fire, putting water on to boil, and gathering the supplies Garnet requested. He helped her to the bed, propping her up with pillows as she'd indicated. "I'm scared," Garnet admitted as another contraction gripped her. Flynn took her hand, letting her squeeze it through the pain. "You can do this," he told her firmly. "You're the strongest woman I've ever met, Garnet Newman." She gave him a weak smile. "I don't feel very strong right now." "Well, you are," Flynn insisted. "You survived that trail when many wouldn't have. You've endured loss and kept going. You're going to bring this baby into the world, and you're both going to be fine." As if in response to his words, the storm broke outside, rain lashing against the cabin windows while thunder rolled across the valley. Inside, Garnet fought her own battle, her labor progressing with frightening speed for a first-time mother. Flynn stayed by her side throughout, wiping her brow with cool cloths, supporting her back when she needed to change positions, and offering encouragement when her strength flagged. He'd never felt so scared or so useful in his entire life. As lightning split the sky outside, Garnet gave one final, tremendous push, and suddenly there was a new sound in the cabin, the indignant wail of a newborn. "It's a girl," Flynn announced, his voice cracking with emotion as he caught the tiny, slippery infant in his hands. A perfect little girl. With shaking hands, he followed Garnet's exhausted instructions to clean the baby and check that all was well before wrapping her in a soft blanket and placing her in her mother's eager arms. "Hello, little one," Garnet whispered, tears streaming down her face as she cradled her daughter. "You're early, but oh, how I've waited for you." Flynn stepped back, giving mother and child their moment of bonding, but Garnet beckoned him closer. "Flynn, I want you to meet Rebecca Faith Newman." She looked up at him, her eyes shining. "I couldn't have done this without you." Flynn gently touched the baby's tiny hand, marveling when her miniature fingers curled around his own. "She's beautiful," he said hoarsely, "like her mother." The words hung in the air between them, more revealing than he'd intended. Garnet's gaze met his, and in that moment, Something shifted between them, an acknowledgement of feelings that had been growing unspoken over the weeks of their unusual cohabitation. The storm outside began to wane, but inside the cabin, a different kind of storm was just beginning in Flynn Ryder's heart. The days following Rebecca's birth were a blur of exhaustion and wonder. Mrs. Hatcher arrived the morning after the storm, having been delayed by the washed-out road. She examined both mother and baby thoroughly, pronounced them healthy despite the early arrival, and gave Flynn a grudging compliment on his handling of the delivery. "You did good, Ryder," she admitted. "Though don't let it go to your head, most of the credit goes to the mother's strength." Flynn had no argument there. Watching Garnet with her daughter filled him with an admiration he'd never felt for another human being. Despite her exhaustion, she approached motherhood with the same quiet determination she'd shown in everything else. As August gave way to September, and Rebecca, or Becky, as Flynn had taken to calling her, grew stronger daily, the temporary nature of their arrangement became increasingly difficult to ignore. Garnet's aunt was still expecting her in Montana, and the window for safe travel before winter would soon close. Flynn found himself inventing reasons for Garnet to delay her departure. The trail would be muddy after the recent rains. Becky was still too small for such a journey. There were reports of trouble with road agents near the Montana border. Each excuse bought a few more days, but he knew they were running out of time. One evening, as Garnet sat nursing Becky in the rocking chair Flynn had traded a half-broken Mustang for, he finally broached the subject they'd both been avoiding. "Winter comes early in these parts," he said, staring into the fire rather than at her. "Another month at most before the passes start to get dangerous." Garnet's hands stilled on Becky's back. "I know," she said quietly. "I need to make arrangements for the journey soon." Flynn nodded, still not looking at her. "I could escort you if you'd like. Make sure you get there safely." "That's very kind," but Garnet hesitated. "You have your business here. I couldn't ask you to leave it for weeks on end. You're not asking, I'm offering." Flynn finally turned to her, his expression serious. "I'd feel better knowing you and Becky were safe." Garnet studied him, her green eyes searching his face. "Why are you doing all this, Flynn? You've already done more than anyone could expect." Flynn ran a hand through his hair, a gesture Garnet had come to recognize as a sign of his discomfort with expressing emotions. "I care what happens to you," he said finally. "Both of you." The simple statement hung in the air between them, weighted with all it didn't say. "I care about you too," Garnet replied softly. "More than I should, perhaps." Flynn moved to kneel beside the rocking chair, his eyes level with hers. "What if you didn't go to Montana?" he asked, the words rushing out as if he feared he might lose his nerve. "What if you stayed here?" Garnet's breath caught. "Flynn, I know it's sudden," he continued quickly. "I know we barely know each other by normal standards. But these past weeks haven't been normal, have they? I feel like I've known you for years, Garnet." "My aunt is expecting me," she said weakly, though her heart had begun to race at his words. "Write to her. Explain that you've found a place here." Flynn took her free hand, his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. "I'm not much. I don't have grand prospects or a fortune, but I have this land, this home, I can provide for you and Becky, and I swear I'd spend every day trying to make you both happy." Garnet stared at him, tears filling her eyes. "Are you asking what I think you're asking?" Flynn nodded, suddenly solemn. "I'm asking you to marry me, Garnet, not out of obligation or because it's proper, but because I've fallen in love with you." "With both of you," he added, glancing at the now sleeping Becky. A tear slipped down Garnet's cheek. "This is madness," she whispered. "We've known each other barely 2 months." "Sometimes madness makes more sense than reason," Flynn replied. "I carried you 15 miles the day we met. I knew even then that you were someone special. I just didn't understand how special until now." Garnet looked down at her daughter, then back at Flynn. "What about Becky? She's not yours." "She could be," Flynn said simply. "If you'd let me, I'd raise her as my own, love her as my own. She'd never know the difference." "I would know," Garnet said, "and I would want her to know how lucky she is to have a father who chose her, who loves her by choice, not just by blood." Flynn's eyes widened as he realized what she was saying. "Is that a yes?" Instead of answering, Garnet leaned forward and pressed her lips gently to his. It was their first kiss, tentative and sweet, filled with promise. "Yes," she whispered against his mouth. "That's a yes." They were married 2 weeks later in a small ceremony at the church in Buffalo with Mrs. Hatcher and a few of Flynn's business associates in attendance. Garnet wore a simple blue dress that Flynn had purchased from the general store, insisting she deserved something new for the occasion, and carried Becky wrapped in the blanket she'd finished knitting just days before. The circuit preacher, accustomed to hasty frontier weddings, raised no eyebrows at the newborn in the bride's arms. He'd seen far more unusual arrangements in his years serving the Wyoming territory. "Do you, Flynn James Ryder, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish till death do you part?" Flynn's eyes never left Garnet's as he answered, "I do." "And do you, Garnet Rose Newman, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish till death do you part?" "I do," Garnet replied, her voice steady and sure. "Then by the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride." Flynn's kiss was gentle but held a promise of deeper passion, appropriate for the setting but leaving Garnet flushed and breathless nonetheless. After a simple meal at the town's only restaurant, they returned to the cabin, their home now, truly shared. Flynn had made small improvements in preparation for their new status, adding curtains to the windows and building a proper crib for Becky that now stood beside their bed. As night fell and Becky slept peacefully in her new crib, husband and wife faced each other with a mixture of shyness and anticipation. Though they had lived together for weeks, this new intimacy was uncharted territory. "I never thought I'd have this again," Garnet confessed as Flynn took her hands in his. "After Thomas died, I resigned myself to raising Becky alone." "You're not alone anymore," Flynn promised. "Neither of you are." That night, they discovered each other with tender exploration, their lovemaking both passionate and gentle, a physical expression of the bond that had grown between them through extraordinary circumstances. Afterward, as Garnet lay with her head on Flynn's chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heart, she marveled at the strange path that had led her here. If she hadn't collapsed on that trail, if Flynn hadn't been tracking those wild horses that day, if he hadn't been the kind of man who would carry a stranger 15 miles to safety, her life would be entirely different. "What are you thinking?" Flynn murmured into her hair. "That sometimes what looks like tragedy can lead to something beautiful," she answered honestly. "If Thomas hadn't died, I never would have been on that trail, never would have met you." Flynn tightened his arms around her. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said. "But I can't be sorry that you found your way to me." "Nor I," Garnet agreed. "It feels like it was meant to be, doesn't it? As if all the hardship was leading us to each other." In the crib, Becky stirred and made a small sound. Flynn was immediately alert, releasing Garnet to check on the baby. "She's fine," he reported, gently stroking the infant's cheek until she settled again. "Just dreaming." Garnet watched him with the baby, this man who had so quickly and completely embraced the role of father. "You're a natural with her." Flynn returned to bed, gathering Garnet close again. "She makes it easy, so perfect, so trusting." He kissed Garnet's forehead. "Like her mother." As autumn painted the Wyoming landscape in vibrant hues, the small family settled into their life together. Flynn continued his horse trading business, though he no longer took extended trips to track wild herds, unwilling to be far from his wife and daughter for long. Garnet wrote to her aunt, explaining her changed circumstances and promising to visit when Becky was older. The reply, when it came, was full of congratulations and an invitation for the entire family to visit the following summer. The cabin, once so sparse and utilitarian, gradually transformed under Garnet's influence. Colorful quilts adorned the walls and beds, curtains softened the windows, and the scent of home-baked bread often filled the air. Flynn expanded the garden, adding a small orchard of apple and cherry trees that would bear fruit in years to come, a symbol of their commitment to this land and each other. Yet not all changes were physical. Flynn, once so solitary and self-contained, blossomed in the presence of his new family. He laughed more easily, spoke more freely, and began to forge connections with neighboring homesteaders whom he'd previously kept at arm's length. Garnet, for her part, regained the confidence that grief had stolen from her, standing tall and proud as Mrs. Flynn Ryder. And Becky thrived, growing from a fragile newborn into a robust, curious infant who clearly adored the man she would always know as her father. Winter came early that year, just as Flynn had predicted, blanketing their valley in snow by mid-October. The long, cold months might have seemed isolating to Garnet once, but now they represented a treasured time of family closeness, with evenings spent around the hearth, planning for the future while the wind howled outside. "I've been thinking," Flynn said one such evening as Garnet sat knitting and Becky slept in her crib. "This cabin's getting too small for us." Garnet looked up in surprise. "I think it's perfect, cozy. Cozy now, maybe, but what about when Becky's older, or if we have more children?" Flynn's eyes held a question as he watched for her reaction, Garnet's hands stilled on her knitting. "More children, if you want them," Flynn said quickly. "I know Becky is still young, and I don't want to presume I do want them," Garnet interrupted softly. "Very much." Flynn's face broke into a wide smile. "Then we'll need a bigger home. I've been saving to buy the Clayton property that borders our land to the north. Good water, better grazing for the horses. We could build something new there, something we designed together." Garnet crossed to his chair and settled herself in his lap, her arms going around his neck. "I think that sounds wonderful, a home for our growing family." Flynn's hand came to rest on her still flat stomach, his expression suddenly wondering, "Are you saying?" Garnet nodded, her eyes shining with happy tears. "Mrs. Hatcher confirmed it yesterday. The baby should come in early summer." Flynn's whoop of joy startled Becky awake, but for once, the baby didn't cry at the disruption. Instead, she watched with wide eyes as her father swept her mother into a dance around the cabin, both of them laughing with the sheer joy of their shared news. Later, as they lay together in the quiet darkness, Flynn placed a protective hand over Garnet's abdomen, marveling at the new life growing there, a life they had created together. "I never thought I'd have this," he confessed, echoing Garnet's earlier sentiment. "A family, a wife, children. After I left Boston, I convinced myself I was better off alone. And now," Garnet prompted, covering his hand with her own, "now I can't imagine life without you, without Becky, without this new little one." Flynn's voice was thick with emotion. "You collapsed on that trail and somehow saved me in the process." "We saved each other," Garnet corrected gently, "and we'll keep saving each other every day." As spring returned to Wyoming, bringing new growth and promise, Flynn and Garnet began work on their new home. The construction would take months, but they were in no rush. Their family was secure in the love they'd found, unexpected and precious. 1 year to the day after Flynn had found Garnet collapsed on the trail, they stood together on the rise overlooking their new property. Becky, now a sturdy 10-month-old with her mother's green eyes and a head full of dark curls, sat on Flynn's shoulders, chattering in her baby language and pointing at a pair of hawks circling overhead. Garnet, her second pregnancy just beginning to show beneath her dress, leaned against her husband's side. "Hard to believe it's been a year," she remarked. "So much has changed." Flynn slipped an arm around her waist, drawing her closer. "For the better, I hope." Garnet lifted her face for his kiss, her expression serene and confident. "For the best," she corrected. "Absolutely for the best." As they stood together on the hillside, the small family bore little resemblance to the desperate woman and solitary man of a year before. The trail that had once threatened Garnet's life had ultimately led to her greatest happiness, and the act of carrying her to safety had opened Flynn's heart in ways he'd never imagined possible. The journey ahead would hold challenges, as all lives do. But Flynn and Garnet would face them together, strengthened by the bond forged in those 15 miles, and all the miles they had traveled since the distance from strangers to soulmates, from solitude to family, from rescue to love.